Better Knowledge, the podcast by Golem. Hello and welcome to another episode. My name is Martin Wolf, and I'm the podcast lead at Golem. I'm visiting George today. Hi.
Hi, Martin.
We're in Olpe, right?
Exactly, Olpe in the Sauerland region.
And it's really beautiful here. I mean, okay, it's pretty grey today because it's been raining constantly, but even like this, when you look around, there are these little hills, almost mountains, with a bit of snow still on top.
Yeah, it's very hilly here, lots of green, lots of forest. And we also have a beautiful lake, the biggest reservoir. A lot of tourists come here, especially from the Netherlands.
Which brings me to my trip here. Getting around locally was very easy, just driving along these quiet roads, really nice, hardly any traffic today. But getting here from Cologne was interesting. And getting to Cologne from Berlin was even more complicated, because Deutsche Bahn somehow managed to be both late and early at the same time. My train got cancelled, then I took a delayed one, which got even more delayed, and somehow I still arrived earlier than I would have with the original train. But everything worked out. Everyone was friendly, I got coffee, so all good, and during the trip I realized, for the second year in a row, that I completely forgot it's carnival season here. George, is carnival your thing?
Not really, I didn't even know it was happening today.
That confirms my experience, because my colleagues, who I was chatting with, were making fun of me for thinking I could just casually travel here and somehow outsmart carnival. But I actually managed it. I barely had anything to do with it. The trains were full of people in costumes, though that was enough. All right, enough about the trip. Let's talk about you, George. This is one of those nice situations where I'm visiting someone who actually listens to the podcast. So, perfect opportunity. Any criticism?
Honestly, nothing really. I listen to your podcast regularly, of course mostly the topics that interest me. Sometimes there are episodes that aren't really my thing, like when you visit museums or libraries. That's not so much my area. I'm more into the retro scene, episodes about computers or people working with specific systems. For example, recently you were in Austria visiting someone who works with a Commodore 128. That was great. He's also a YouTuber I follow, and the episode about that museum with all the mainframes, that was also really interesting.
Technicum 29.
Yes, exactly.
What's interesting is that, even though not that many people listen to this podcast, I can still look at the numbers. And I've noticed that these so-called niche topics, where I drift away from retro computing, don't actually lose listeners. I find that really fascinating. It could have gone the other way, that I get stuck doing only retro topics because that's all people want, but that's not the case at all. So thanks to the audience for that, it gives me more freedom. And I've been saying for a while that I wanted to do an episode about the C16 and the whole 264 series, which is what we're talking about today. You've heard me mention that a few times, right? And you kept wondering when it would finally happen?
Exactly, I kept asking myself, when is that +4 episode finally coming? You've mentioned it quite often. And in that Austria episode, you said you'd like to do it, but you couldn't find the right person. And I thought, okay, then I guess I'll have to step in. I'm not really someone who likes speaking publicly, but for the +4, I would do it.
And I would too. I think it's fantastic that this worked out, because I always had these forum threads open, looking at people discussing it, but there was never a clear focal point, a person to talk to. So I'm really grateful that you're stepping up here, and I think the audience will be too. So let's start from the beginning. How did you actually get into this? Your first machine was the +4, and mine was the C16. How did you end up with the +4?
Well, I was always interested in video games and computers, even back around 1980. Let me give you the full story if that's okay.
Please do.
In 1980, I had a friend who owned an Atari VCS, the Atari 2600. Back then, it was really expensive. He invited me over to play and I loved it. Of course, I wanted one too, but it was too expensive for my family. Then in 1983, we had an exhibition at school where kids could bring their toys. One boy brought a Commodore 64, which had just come out. He had it set up and you could play 2 games on it, GR Kung Fu and Rambo 2. At the time, those felt like some of the best games ever. It was also the golden age of arcade games, Phoenix, Pac-Man, Dig Dug and so on. We played a lot of arcade games on vacation too. My favorites were Phoenix, Pac-Man and Dig Dug, you name it. Everyone wanted to have those arcade experiences at home, and the C64 came closest. So naturally I wanted a C64, but again too expensive. I once visited a classmate who had a Commodore 16 and we played winter events on it. I thought, okay, if I can't get a C64, maybe I can get a C16. I think I was around 14 at the time, so I went with my mother to a hi-fi shop and asked if they sold the Commodore 16. The guy looked at me and clearly had no idea what I was talking about. He said, I'll make a call during my lunch break and let you know. We came back in the evening and he looked surprised that we returned. And then said, all right, I call now. That's when I realized he hadn't done anything. He didn't know what a C16 was and I thought, okay, forget it. I'm never getting a computer. But then Aldi had a promotion. They were selling a Commodore Plus 4 starter kit for 239 Deutsche Mark. For comparison, a C64 cost about 600 Mark just for the computer, and if you wanted a floppy drive, that was another 600. So this was a real bargain. Of course, 239 Mark was still a lot of money. My mother was a single parent with her kids, but I already felt that my future would be in computing. Even though back then that was a very nerdy thing. People didn't really know what computers were. You connected them to your TV, and if you wanted a monitor, that was another big expense. Anyway, with some persistence and a bit of begging, I got the Commodore. That was my first computer, and that's why I still have that nostalgia and attachment to it today.
And when you got the Plus 4, you already knew what the C16 could do. Did you also know at the time that the Plus 4 had more memory and those built-in applications? That it was, in some way, the better machine?
Yes, I knew that. I think before I got mine, 2 friends of mine already had one. We were a group of 3 and they were also buying magazines, Compute Mid, for example, so we knew that the Plus 4 was somewhat closer to the C64 in terms of memory and capabilities, but we also knew it wasn't really compatible and that the games weren't as good. That part was clear to us.
Right, that compatibility issue. As a kid, you sometimes don't think about that. I once read a story where someone got their first console and thought, well, these are cartridges, and Atari has cartridges, so I'll just try them, without realizing they wouldn't work. But you didn't have those illusions.
No, because at school everyone had different systems. One had the C64, another had the C16. You got a sense of what worked and what didn't, just from talking on the playground.
I first saw a Commodore 116 back in East Germany. There was an event at school, something like an open day, where people could present things they had built or brought along. One room was a kind of computer lab, and people had set up their machines. It was actually possible to send computers from West Germany to the East, through relatives. It was expensive, of course, but it happened. And that's how quite a few C16S and C116S ended up there, because they were cheaper. If a family in the West had to decide what to send, and there was an Aldi deal like the one you mentioned, then that's what they'd pick. I remember that C116 very clearly. It's the smallest model. We'll talk more about the lineup in a moment, but visually it's completely different from other Commodore machines of that time. The Plus 4 and the C116 both have a totally different design language. It really appealed to me back then. This small, flat computer, dark grey, with those fake cooling vents, it looked kind of elegant. Definitely more promising than what it could actually do. And those tiny flat keys, I had no idea they were terrible. I just thought it looked cool. I don't remember much about what they were actually showing on it, I was too young for the technical side. But later, a friend of mine had a Commodore 16 with a datasette and some tapes. He owned it privately. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, I'm not sure what happened, maybe he got a new computer, but that C16 became available, and I bought it from him. And just carrying that thing home and having my own computer, it didn't matter what was inside or what it could do. For me, the key moment was, I plugged this into my TV, and now I decide what happens on the screen. That was the amazing part.
I can totally relate to that, especially the idea of the computer as a platform for creativity. A TV was passive, you just consumed content, but with a computer, suddenly you could actively do something with it.
Exactly. Sorry to interrupt, but that was my thing too, I could control what appeared on the screen. And there was, as usual with Commodore, a basic manual included. And that basic was actually much better than the one on the C64, which isn't saying much, but still. It had real features, you could draw directly on the screen, create moving objects from BASIC, and even access the sound generator, all without deep technical knowledge. And it even had a built-in machine code monitor, right?
Yes, exactly, a monitor. It was later ported to the C128 as well.
Right, you could type the command monitor in BASIC, and suddenly you were in this machine language environment. And what I loved, once I figured it out, was that you could inspect memory and even modify things, like changing fonts in games.
Yeah, that was really cool.
So how did things continue for you? You had the machine, did you immediately have games you liked?
Yes, definitely. For example, Winter Events. That was one of the best commercial games for the platform. It's a winter sports game, basically Olympic events. It had 6 disciplines: biathlon, slalom, bobsled, speed skating, cross-country skiing and sky jumping. For that platform, it was an amazing game. It was even better than the C64 version, and some people, even without realizing it was running on a C16 with just 16 kilobytes, thought it was an Amiga game because the graphics were so good.
It was really lovingly made. Beautiful background graphics. We'll definitely link to it, or at least to a video of it. It was programmed by someone named Udo Gertz, who we'll probably talk about later. And it had that bobsled event, where you drove down this kind of semis 3D tube. We played that game so much. Really, really often.
And the cool thing was, you could play it with up to 4 players. There aren't that many games where you can do that even today.
True. Of course, everything required patience. Loading from cassette took time. But with only 16 kilobytes, you already mentioned that, there's only so much data to load. Compared to other systems, even without a fast loader, the C16 had pretty reasonable loading times. But I had one game, it was my personal nemesis. It wasn't even a good game, and I knew it. But it had an amazing title screen and music that sounded better than anything else on the C16 at the time. It was called Championship Wrestling. Really not a good game, but I'll still link it. In fact, we could even play the music here. For me, back then, that was the best sound the C16 could produce. I would load the game just to hear that music and see that screen. And it took forever to load. I didn't have any other game that took that long, and often it didn't load at all. Did you ever have problems with your tapes? All my games were originals. We'll get to software availability later, but did you have issues?
Sure, but you could adjust the tape head with a small screwdriver. There was a little hole in the dataset. That's what the cassette drive was called. And you had to adjust it from time to time or clean it.
All things I never did in my life. Honestly, that never even occurred to me. But I think my tapes were already worn out, they were several years old at that point. And that particular tape just refused to cooperate again and again. Alright, let's move on. Actually, no, let's structure this properly. Let's talk about the hardware. So, the 264 series, we have the smallest and cheapest model, the C116 with 16 kilobytes. Then there's the C16, which looks a bit like the breadbox C64, but in a darker grey. And then there's the Commodore Plus 4, which looks more like the C116 but is bigger and more solid.
And has a proper full-size keyboard in white.
Exactly. So, what's the technical foundation?
The technical foundation is the TED chip, and that chip was originally developed as a competitor to the ZX Spectrum. Back then, Jack Tramiel wanted to create a rival in order to enter the low-cost market, where computers were a bit cheaper. That was exactly the space the ZX Spectrum occupied. To do that, he planned to launch the TED series. The original idea behind the 264 series was actually the C116, the machine you just mentioned, the small one with a chiclet keyboard, those rubber keys. And it even looks quite similar to the ZX Spectrum, black with that rubber keys. The goal was to bring it to market for $49, and to achieve that, they had to consolidate all the chips into one large chip. That was the TED chip, which handled both graphics, output, and sound.
And that was developed in-house at Commodore?
Exactly. The lead developer was Bill Hurt and Dave Haney, who later also worked on the Amiga, was responsible for making sure it could be manufactured cheaply and continuously optimized. A lot of what they learned from the TED series was later applied to the C128 and the Amiga. So while the machine was a flop on the market, mainly because the C16 was always compared to the C64, the underlying idea was quite different. On top of that, Jack Tramiel left the company around that time, and because of that, the original vision sort of fizzled out, which eventually led to the C16 and Plus 4.
So originally it was meant to be super cheap, and things like premium feel didn't matter that much, although I'd argue the machine still felt more high quality than the competition, but that's debatable. And from that, the other models evolved. The CPU is still a 6502, right?
6502 compatible. It's not the 6502 itself. It's the 7501 CPU, and later an improved 8501. It runs at 1.77 MHz in PAL mode.
Okay, that's quite a bit faster than the C64.
The C64 uses the 6502 at about 0.985 MHz in PAL mode, but on the Plus 4, the TED chip and the CPU share the bus equally, so effectively it ends up being about as fast as the C64, unless you turn off the graphics mode, in which case you get the full power of the Plus 4.
So the development of the TED chip must have started in the early 80s. They probably didn't have much time, right?
I don't know all the details, but I think when Bill Hurt joined Commodore, development was already underway. He more or less took it over. From what I recall, the original TED developer noticed that Hurt was quite capable and then left the project, handing it over to him.
And then this young guy, he was really young at the time, right?
Yeah, 23. Thrown straight in at the deep end.
Given that, it's actually pretty impressive. If you look at it in isolation, the chips in the C64 or the VICI and the SID were incredible. Trying to build something similarly capable in a single chip and without much experience, that's a huge challenge. Many of the people who had worked on the C64 had already left. So considering that, the TED chip turned out quite well. If you compare, the TED had 3 audio channels.
Only 2.
Only 2, right. And then there was the ability to display moving objects, like the C64 could. The C64 famously had 8 sprites, small movable objects handled directly by the chip, though not accessible in BASIC without using machine code. The C16 had so-called shapes. What's the difference?
Shapes are basically just parts of the screen stored in a string, a small variable. Sprites are overlays handled by the chip itself, whereas shapes are just copied screen areas you can move around. But it's very slow and no good for games in BASIC.
That's kind of a strange design choice.
Well, you could use it for something like a chess game. Imagine a grid. You could store a piece as a shape and copy it from one square to another. That's one way to think about it. The colors were another advantage. The TED chip had 121 colors. Technically it had 128, but with restrictions similar to the C64. You couldn't really color every pixel. There were 8 base colors with 8 shades each, but black had 8 shades that all looked identical, so effectively you ended up with 121 distinct colors.
I always wondered why it wasn't a clean number like 64 or 128. Now that mystery is solved. 8 shades of black that all look the same.
As for sound, it only had square waves, so it sounded like a PC speaker. But what people can get out of that today, even with just 2 channels and some noise, it's pretty amazing. Still, it was very limited.
Let's use that as a cue to play another audio example, a modern track from the scene. We'll link some of those as well. Another difference, you can connect the C64's disk drive, but not its dataset. And more importantly, something I found terrible as a kid, you couldn't use standard C64 or Atari joysticks. Instead, there were small mini-DIN ports. Do we know why?
That comes from the original C116 design. There simply wasn't enough space for standard ports, so they had to use smaller ones. You can use adapters though, so it's not a huge problem.
I had some of those adapters and later even got original joysticks, but honestly, they weren't very good. Did you have better ones?
No, I had the original ones too. There's actually a funny story from Bill Hurd about breaking a prototype during a meeting. So Bill Hurd, the designer of the Plus 4 series, the whole 264 line, he worked with Ira Valensky, and he's also known from the Atari line, like the Atari ST. He designed that series as well. And for the whole 264 series, there was also matching peripheral hardware designed for it. The idea was that this computer would be a small business machine, right? So they also designed a matching printer in the same black or gray color scheme and a monitor, the 1801. Which is quite rare to find today. Even the joysticks were designed in the same style. The prototype of that joystick was presented in a meeting, and Bill Hurd said, "If I may point this out, this part down here, where the base connects to the stick, that looks very thin in the prototype." He said, "That's not going to hold, the joystick will break there over time." The designer responded, no, it'll hold, it will be fine." So they kept discussing it. Then Bill Hurd picked up the joystick and tried to break it by force. It took a bit of effort, but he managed, and you could hear a crack and a snap. And he said, "See, the joystick is broken." And that prototype apparently cost something like $30,000 because it was just a prototype. But he made his point, and they actually redesigned the joystick afterward.
I think they look nice, but they're not particularly great to play with, and now you've brought the Plus for itself back into the conversation. We hadn't really talked about the name yet. Why is it actually called Plus 4?
Because it had 4 built-in applications, an office suite in ROM, word processor, spreadsheet, graphics and a database. There's a great story about that too. The software was developed by David Johnson from Tree Micro. His original product, Your Home Office, ran on the C64 and Atari 800. He spent 8 months porting it to the Plus 4, aiming for a 64 kilobyte ROM, but 4 weeks before release, he was told to cut it down to 32 kilobytes. He managed it, but that's why the software ended up with a bad reputation, even though it was originally quite good.
And that really sums up the story: constant shifts in direction. First, ultra-cheap ZX Spectrum competitor. Then, a slightly more refined version. Then, a business-oriented machine. And finally, cutting features at the last minute.
Exactly. The project also suffered from internal power struggles at Commodore. Tramiel had already left for Atari, and the new leadership didn't fully support it. Many managers moved to Atari as well. Under those circumstances, it's almost surprising that the Plus 4 was released at all.
But yeah, it's kind of wild. I mean, sure, once something like that gets going, it's like a train that's already left the station, right? Everything's in motion, a lot of money has already been spent. You just said that even a prototype for a joystick alone can easily cost several $1,000s. And then a new management comes in, would actually prefer to cancel the whole project, but sees how much has already been invested and says, okay, let's just somehow push this through.
Exactly. Another interesting thing he mentioned is that the software was inspired by Lotus 123 on IBM PCs, because he had experience with modeling software from that time at IBM, and to save memory, he relied on system internal math routines that had originally been written by Bill Gates.
Good thing he never found out, so now you've got this Plus 4, and you probably realize that the software you can actually buy for it, you had yours at a time when software was still available. I didn't, but we'll get to that. You realize that most of the software doesn't really make full use of the machine's capabilities, right? I mean, there were some games that specifically used the Plus 4's features. You'd see 64K printed on the box and so on, but most of the games and software were designed for the smaller machines. People just didn't bother developing for such a niche audience. Was that something you were aware of?
Yes, I was. And it was also kind of disappointing, especially one game I really wanted. I mentioned that I had seen Jia Kung Fu on the C64. There was also a version for the C16 and Plus 4, so I thought, great, I'll get that for my Plus 4. I was really excited to buy it, and I remember there's actually a funny story about that. I couldn't get the game anywhere, so I asked a classmate if he knew anyone who had it. He said, well, I know someone who programs for the C64, maybe he could port it. And I was super skeptical, like, port the C64 game to the C16? No, okay. So I waited like 3 weeks, then he comes back and says, sorry, it's not that easy after all. I was really disappointed. At that time, I really wanted to play Jia Kung Fu. There was no internet back then, and the game was never really shown anywhere. But it cost 40 marks. I thought, that has to be a really good game, right? Years later, I finally got my hands on it, and honestly, that's exactly why the 264 series got such a bad reputation. The ports were made for the C16, meaning 16K games. It was basically a stripped-down version of the original. No sound, terrible controls. Yeah, we were aware of that, and it was really disappointing. We always kind of hoped we'd eventually get a C64 or something like that. We knew the games weren't that great on this system.
Alright, now we're deep into software already. So let me jump in, and my big disappointment was this one. I even brought the cassette with me. My biggest disappointment was Ghosts and Goblins on the C16. Just like you with Kung Fu, I knew Ghosts and Goblins. I knew it was an amazing game with a great soundtrack and everything. And then I bought the cassette. The back of the box even had screenshots that looked good. Oh, you've got it too. Nice, very nice. Look at that, we both have our disappointment trophies. The disappointment level is already pretty high, but I think we can still top it later. The graphics on the back look good, and I thought, well, how bad can it really be? Not like I expected it to be bad, but I just had to have it. So I loaded it up. And yeah, that feeling. You probably know it.
But speaking of that game, good that you brought it up. Do you know the news about it?
You told me, I think, or I saw it on your YouTube channel, which we'll of course link in the show notes. There's actually a proper port now.
Exactly, there's a new port based on the C64 version that came out a few years ago. Of course, you can't just reuse the code one-to-one because the Plus4 doesn't have a SID chip and no sprites. But the scene is incredibly talented. Many of them are the same people from the 80s, often from Hungary and the Eastern Bloc. And they actually managed to create a really good version of Ghosts and Goblins. I can definitely recommend it.
My second huge disappointment, I bought it without knowing anything about it, was Super Gran. I think it's one of the worst games I've ever played in my life. Truly awful. But what comforts me a bit is that I once saw in a video that the ZX Spectrum version is just as terrible. So at least it's consistently bad across platforms. You mentioned earlier that it wasn't easy to get hold of tapes. How did you manage? I mean, when you first got the machine, there must have still been some software available, right?
Yeah, there was this hi-fi shop that occasionally had software, but mostly for the C64. If there were 100 C64 games, there were maybe 10 +4 or C16 games. That's just how it was. You got games the usual way back then, borrowed from classmates and so on.
Could you just copy them with a tape recorder?
Yes, you could copy them, and because Aldi had sold the machine, it had a certain level of popularity. There were actually quite a few people who had games for it.
So you were at least somewhat supplied. I wasn't. I was sitting there in Potsdam all alone with my C16. And one day, well, I was still a kid, and a bit younger than you, I heard about this new electronics store. You know, in East Germany there were intershops where you could buy Western goods if you had Western currency or forum checks. After the wall fell, our intershop turned into a big electronics store, huge place, all the latest stuff. So you were at least somewhat supplied. I wasn't. I was sitting there in Potsdam all alone with my C16. And one day, well, I was still a kid, and a bit younger than you, I heard about this new electronics store. You know, in East Germany there were intershops where you could buy Western goods if you had Western currency or forum checks. After the wall fell, our intershop turned into a big electronics store, huge place, all the latest stuff. I stood there in front of a Sega Mega Drive and thought, wow. Just look at that. 16-bit. And I went in thinking, okay, maybe they'll still have something for my C16 in 1990. Of course, they didn't. But one of the sales guys, he must have lived in Berlin, I never found out, said, look, we don't have any, but I can get you some. And then I'd buy tapes from him for 10 marks each, completely blind. He'd bring whatever he found in some bargain bin in West Berlin and sell it to me under the counter. That's how my collection grew. I started with maybe 6 or 7 tapes and ended up with 20 or 30 and spent a lot of money on that guy. But honestly, how else was I supposed to get games? And that leads to my favorite game. Actually, one of two. I'll mention mine first. My favorite game was called G-Man. The gameplay is super simple. You control a little guy, and when you press the fire button, he floats up a bit. When you release it, he drops. The landscape scrolls continuously. You can't really stop, you just keep moving forward. Today you'd probably compare it to something like an endless runner, kind of like Flappy Bird. It sounds simple, but it hooked me for hours. You had to dodge obstacles, manage your fuel, decide whether it's worth going down to refill or avoiding danger. And in the end, it's all about high score. Really simple, but super engaging, so that's one of mine. What about you?
So one I played a lot was Winter Olympiad. You already mentioned that. Then Space Pilot, also from Kingsoft. That was kind of like, well, I think the original was called Time Pilot. Something like that, right? A similar kind of game. A shooter, a space shooter, one of the better ones. People who had a +4 or C16 will know what I'm talking about. Another very good game, and actually an exclusive one, is Oblido. It's more a puzzle game, with a bit of action mixed in. It only exists on the C16, though I think there are ports nowadays. Definitely something I can recommend. Thrust is also a really good game. It's a kind of like physics-based game where you control a little lander and have to pick up a small object that moves realistically. So there's some physics simulation going on. Very good game, and it exists on many platforms. Those are the ones I'd recommend. Of course, there are also a lot of new games nowadays that I show on my channel, but I leave those aside for now.
We'll get back to the programmer we mentioned earlier, Udo Gertz, in a moment. But first, I'll mention my second favorite game. We'll link all the ones you mentioned. I've noted them down so people can try them in an emulator. My second favorite was Dorks Dilemma. I've never really found it anywhere else. I even looked again recently to see if there was a port. What I didn't realize back then was that it's basically Bomberman in disguise, and without multiplayer. I think with multiplayer it would have been perfect for the C16. No idea why they didn't do that. Basically, it works like Bomberman. You place bombs with a timer, avoid enemies, and try to eliminate them. There are no upgrades or leveling systems. The goal is just to clear all levels. And there's this little dog character who's kind of cute. At the end, he flies away or something like that. I played that for hours. It's a very calm, almost relaxing game, but probably the most well-known games, at least in Germany, came from the company Kingsoft, and specifically from a programmer named Udo Gertz. What do we actually know about him?
Not much, to be honest. He kind of disappeared. I think he lives somewhere in Switzerland now. That would actually be a great podcast guest for you, if you could track him down and interview him. I'd love to hear that. In any case, he's a legend in the scene. Back then, he made really good games that actually pushed the platform quite far. One of his most famous is Ghost Town, I think, or Tom Thumb.
Yeah, Tom Thumb. That was basically meant to show that even the C16 could handle a large-scale action game. It's a platformer where you jump around from screen to screen. There's no smooth scrolling, the screens just flip, but still, you control this small character and explore a pretty big labyrinth.
A big labyrinth, yeah.
And I found it incredibly frustrating. The controls just weren't precise enough for me, or maybe I wasn't precise enough for the controls. You could argue that too. I've seen walkthroughs where people manage everything perfectly, but as a kid I failed constantly.
Yeah, I have to agree. The controls weren't the best, but for what the C16 and Plus4 was, it was still one of the better games. Especially the music. I think his sister Brigitte Gertz often handled that. She's listed in the credits, and speaking of credits, something worth mentioning is the Winter Olympiad intro music. During the opening ceremony, it plays well-known themes from that era, like the theme from Dallas, for example.
Those names in the credits, when I was a kid, that was actually a kind of quality seal. If it said Udo Gertz or Kingsoft, you knew, okay, this is probably a solid choice. That's why those names stuck. Like you said, he became a bit of a legend. And believe me, I did try to track him down.
Oh, really?
Still, it would be fascinating to hear the stories behind those games, because so much of it came from his own creativity. Unlike things like the Winter games, which existed on multiple platforms, games like Ghost Town or Tom Thumb were original creations. And technically, he must have really understood that machine inside and out.
A very talented programmer. There was also a Summer Games version, by the way. It's even better in my opinion. I like that one a lot too. Maybe he'll hear your podcast somehow. It would be quite the coincidence.
That would be something. So Udo, if you're listening, the email address is podcast@golem.de. And if anyone knows him, feel free to reach out as well. Alright, now let's move on to Plus for software in general. There were some titles that actually benefited from the machine's stronger capabilities. I wrote down Mercenary, that vector-based game. Pretty impressive, right?
Yeah, that was on multiple platforms. C64, Plus4, Atari, pretty much everything. And I think it ran a bit smoother on the Plus4 than on the C64, though not by a huge margin.
And Elite as well.
Yeah, there's even a modern community version now that removes flickering. I'm not sure if the C64 scene has something similar, but it's really impressive what people have achieved, especially in areas where you don't rely on sprites like vector graphics. The Plus4 can really shine. And over the years, the scene has figured out how to get the most out of it.
Do we know if the Plus4 had any real success in professional applications, or did it fail there as well?
Interestingly, when the Plus4 was launched, there were about 20 software packages for different industries. Things like accounting, payroll, and so on, not very well known today. The problem was, most of that software also existed on the C64, often as ports. So why buy a Plus4 if you could have the same software on the C64 and also get a great gaming machine on top? Still, the bundled 3+1 software package was supported for quite a while. There was even a disk-based version and a newsletter called Exchange Plus that supported it until around 1990. Apparently, it was quite popular in Europe, especially among small businesses. But eventually, the timing wasn't right. The Plus4 came out right when 16-bit systems like Atari ST and the Amiga were arriving, so people moved on.
For me, my time with the C16 wasn't very long either. As a kid, everything feels longer in hindsight, but I'd say maybe a year and a half. How long did you actively use yours?
I think maybe 3 or 4 years. Then it actually broke, some chip burned out. I gave it to a friend to repair, but I never got it back. And that was basically the end of my Plus4 era. In the meantime, I already had bought a Sega Master System, and yeah, the world moved on. Consoles became a thing, Nintendo came along, and honestly we wanted different kinds of games, although I did enjoy programming in BASIC. Things like vector graphics, and funnily enough, 30 or 40 years later, that actually turned into a piece of software I released a few years ago.
That's a nice transition to the present. My brother and I also got a Master System from our parents back then, the Master System 2. And I remember thinking, yeah, I liked it, Sonic was great, there were some good games, but visually, I always thought the original Master System looked much cooler. It had this more professional look. I had the first version. It just looked nicer than the rounded one, but anyway. Back to today, you mentioned earlier that a chip in your machine burned out. If you go looking for these computers now, they're actually still fairly easy to find. I checked online briefly, apart from the C116, which has become quite expensive, probably because it sold the least, the others are still relatively affordable. But you do have to watch out, the TED chip can burn out. That's a known weak point.
Yeah, these machines do have a few weak spots. For example, if you plug or unplug the joystick while the system is running, you can kill the TED chip. Luckily, mine still works, knock on wood. But yeah, you really need to make sure a device has been tested before buying it. Prices are still relatively low, but they are starting to rise. You should also check the power supply. Don't just plug in any random one. You could damage the machine. Better to get a modern replacement or at least measure the voltages. A lot of people also add heat sinks to the TED and CPU. Some even use active cooling, though that's probably overkill. The TED already has a kind of metal shielding on the Plus4 that acts as a heat spreader, but the thermal paste inside is often dried out and should be replaced. Another recommendation is recapping, replacing all the capacitors. And this is just my theory, but I would avoid using Datasette if possible, since it draws power through the system and puts extra strain on it. I use an SD2IEC drive instead.
Before we started recording, I looked at your setup. You've got one of those rare black monitors, a Plus 4, AC116, and a joystick. And next to them, two modern storage solutions, an SD2IEC and a Raspberry Pi-based device with an adapter board that emulates floppy drives. What's the difference?
The Pi 1541 is a full emulator. It replicates a Commodore 1541 disk drive almost perfectly, like 99.9%. That's important for certain demos that rely on exact timing. The SD2IEC works differently. It's not as compatible, but it's faster and more convenient. You can just use SD cards, no need for old disks, which aren't always reliable anymore. The Pi setup is more expensive. You need a Raspberry Pi like a 3B Plus and the adapter board. I paid around 70 euros total, but I think it's worth it. The SD2IEC drive costs about 30 euros. You can go cheaper if you want.
So basically, if you need perfect accuracy, including the original loading behavior, you go with the Pi. If you just want to load and save programs easily, SD2IEC is better. And yeah, cassette drives. They have the usual problems. The rubber belts degrade over time, either they crack or turn into sticky goo.
One more thing, the Plus 4 series also had its own dedicated disk drive, the 1551.
I've never actually seen one in person.
Yeah, I have one, but it's broken. They fail quite easily. It's about 4 times faster than a standard 1541 because it uses a parallel connection instead of a serial.
Commodore actually got the interface right this time.
It's this big cartridge, like a thing that plugs into the back, and you can even stack another cartridge on top of it. It looks pretty wild, like a chain sticking out of the back. You definitely need a big desk for setups like that. But if you want one today, it's rare and expensive, and there's no guarantee it will work. It's kind of the unicorn of the disk drives.
The other unicorn is the C116. Even though it's expensive now, it's often broken, especially the keyboard membrane under the rubber keys. It's notorious for failing.
Yeah, or maybe that's just how it's supposed to be. You really have to hit the keys just right.
It's frustrating, in any case. That's actually why I never bought one. I still have my original C16, and at some point I thought, wouldn't it be nice to also get a Plus 4? So I picked one up cheaply. But when I considered adding a C116, saw the prices and the issues, I decided 2 is enough.
Yeah, I got lucky and found one for about 100 euros, untested, but it worked. I really wanted it for my collection. I used to have one complete in the original box, but sold it years ago, and now it's way too expensive to buy again.
That's collecting for you, but you're still active today. You even wrote your own 3D renderer for the Plus 4.
Yes, I did. The idea actually goes back to the 80s. I used to watch Battlestar Galactica, and there were these scenes with vector graphics on green phosphor screens, like radar displays. I wanted to recreate that on the Plus 4. Back then, I even borrowed a book about 3D graphics for the Amiga and tried to adapt it in BASIC. I managed to render simple cubes. The idea stuck with me. Then, during the pandemic, I finally had the time to revisit it. I wrote a 3D renderer that can take models from Blender, process them with a converter. I wrote in C# and render them on the Plus 4. We are talking about models up to 2,800 vertices.
Which is quite a lot for that machine.
It's all written in BASIC. It even includes a hidden line algorithm, so it doesn't just draw wireframes. It handles occlusion properly. You can even invert the rendering and display filled surfaces in 2 colors. It's obviously very slow, but it works, and you can create some really nice visuals.
We won't say how slow exactly. People should try it themselves. Press a key, make a coffee, or go to sleep and then see how long it takes to render a Blender model on a Plus 4. Alright, we are heading toward the end. But before we wrap up, let's mention where people can still learn more about the 264 series today. There's your channel, which we'll link. And there are forums like Plus for World, the whole site just screams 264 series. You mentioned earlier that the Hungarian scene is very active. I assume a lot of leftover machines ended up there?
Exactly. Remaining stock was sold to Hungary, and the government used them in schools to teach computer science. That created a whole generation of users who really learned the machine inside and out, and they are still active today.
That's such a fascinating story, an entire generation growing up with this system and sticking with it because of nostalgia.
Yeah, and while the Plus 4 is often seen as a failure, for them it was a huge opportunity. It was cheap, accessible, and allowed many people to learn programming. And the people who came out of that, some of them are incredibly skilled.
And honestly, for us too, it was something special. Having your own computer, something different from everyone else's. Even if it didn't last forever, it still meant a lot, so thank you, George, for sharing your experiences with the Plus 4 scene. We'll try to include everything we mentioned in the show notes, which has grown to about 18 items by now. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you and bye-bye.